also, publishing communist or socialist paraphernalia. And so they were doing all this stuff, and people started realizing, oh, these guys are really crazy. She married, one thing I neglected to mention, so she was married very young, when she was 15, to a man who was basically like an alcoholic, a man who would frequent brothels. And she ended up she married another man afterwards who was a Civil War veteran. His name was Colonel James Harvey Blood. Great name, James Blood. And he was the head of the Spiritualist Society. And apparently when they first met, it was one of those things where they both realized that actually when she met, she suddenly fell into a trance, and apparently both were betrothed on the spot by the powers of the air. So these two were pretty out there. But it came out that she was actually living with her first husband while she was, married to her second husband. Obviously, that's, especially during the Victorian age, very scandalous. Now, her first husband was kind of just a total wreck. And so she justified it by saying, oh, well, this was an act of charity on my part. But things like that, people just kind of realized, whoa, this is kind of crazy. A lot of details about their family came out. And the fact that she actually, probably the most controversial thing she supported was free love, basically open marriages. And, so imagine how scandalized people were at that time about this kind of stuff. And then there were the stories about her parents and the fact that her dad may have prostituted them out. And, historians debate on whether that actually happened, but there were definitely rumors of it. So all of that really, like before the election even happened, suddenly her and her sister, all this stuff comes out, and they're basically just, people back and forth all over the country were like they were using pretty unpleasant words to describe both of them, and so essentially, and the suffragists at that point were like, oh, actually we don't associate with these people at all, so yeah, it was a pretty rough time for them, and it really, she was less than 35 when she ran for president, so it's one of those things where very young she became very famous, and then suddenly she became very tarnished very quickly. And the other thing I was going to say is that Harper's Weekly, they actually ran a cartoon of her where they actually made her to look like Satan, and they called her Mrs. Satan. Which really kind of showed you how people felt about her, that she was this evil influence on the country. So,
horse suffragist, you find a spunky candidate that you think can live up to your ideals, and she embodies every single bad stereotype that people would have if women get the right to the vote, they're going to proclaim free love and become communists and be bigamists and everything else and get into weird spiritual stuff and cults. So
yeah,
that's rough.
Yeah.
Put your money on the wrong horse.
It is. It's very interesting. Despite all that, and whatever one might say about her views, one thing I will say, just reading about her, is that had to have been just very difficult for anybody, because for a while she was really shunned by a lot of people, and she actually spent a lot of her life just going on the lecture circuit and just giving lectures, and all these suffragists at first, but then I guess maybe mainly radicals would listen to her and her sister. But it's interesting because after all that, and there's also a scandal. There's a sex scandal that happens during this, and they weren't directly involved in it, but there was this preacher who was very prominent, and they published an article about him. He was Reverend Henry Ward Beecher. He's very prominent, and he was related to the Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote the famous book before the Civil War. But he attacked them, saying free love is horrible and all that. And so they retaliated by exposing marital infidelity on his part, and there was this trial about that, because it was actually illegal at the time to publish anything like that. It was considered libel. And it's funny because Victoria Woodhull was actually arrested on the day of the election because of publishing that. And there's a story that she actually hid as a Quaker woman to get to escape, to elude capture. I mean, it's just like out of a movie, you know. And she was in prison. And so it's funny, again, historically, you know, people will read, oh, the first woman to run for president was in prison on election night. And the implication is that it had something to do with the election. It actually didn't. It had something to do with, you know, the fact that she published this scandalous story. And ironically, that same year, Susan B. Anthony was arrested for trying to vote in that election, which is unrelated to this whole thing. But anyways, that trial that happened, Victoria Woodhull and her sister were just run through the gutter, and they, you know, people were just trying to slander each other as much as possible to discredit the other side. It was very ugly, and she really, you know, at some point, her and Tennessee just moved to England, where she had divorced Colonel Blood, and then they married rich guys out in England, and they kind of, as time went on, you know, in the early 20th century, they kind of became like these dowager suffragist ladies, you know, that were, you know, the younger suffragists would look at them and say, oh, these were, you know, she was one of the great young suffragists. And so they kind of became these old respected figures who married really rich guys at the end of their life. Very fascinating. And I think from what I remember, her sister, Tennessee Claflin, married a man of nobility. So she had some fancy title and would see the queen. And I mean, it's just crazy, crazy story.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. That's a fascinating story. There has to be a movie to be made about that somewhere, because like you said, it's easy to just strip it down to this was a early candidate who was persecuted for trying to assert herself as a woman in politics. And I'm sure some of that is true, but then there's a whole lot more to the story. Well, I'd like to jump ahead a century and look at candidates in the middle of the 20th century. We've passed the suffrage movement. Women have the right to vote. We're somewhere in second wave feminism, depending on how you define it. Let's go up to 1964 and look at Margaret Chase Smith. She's also a presidential candidate. So could you tell me about her? What's her background and what prompted her to run?
Yeah, Margaret Chase Smith, I think you could say, was probably the first woman with an established political career in the mainstream to run. Now, between her and when Victoria Woodhull ran, obviously a lot of things happened, not just women's suffrage, but a lot of women were now in politics, and they were getting elected to different offices. And also, there were women that actually did run for president between the two, but, you know, they were usually pretty pie-in-the-sky candidacies. But Margaret Chase Smith, basically her husband, she got into politics because she married a man who was much older than him. His name's Clyde Smith, who was a congressman, a longtime congressman from Maine. And they were married for a number of years, and he died, but before he died, actually, when he was rather sick, she had worked for him in his office, but she kind of did a lot of his duties. She pretty much knew what it was like to be a member of Congress. And when he died, she basically, this is what they called the widow's mandate, and it had happened a few times before where, you know, a member of Congress died and their spouse would actually kind of fill in the rest of his term. But you know, she did that, and then she won special election, and then she just kept winning the seat because since she had kind of done his job, she was very well established, and the people of Maine, they decided they wanted her to keep the seat, and then she was elected to the Senate. So she was the first woman in American history to serve in both houses.
How long was she a representative and a senator for, approximately?
Well, so he died in 1940, and she pretty much took over his seat from there. And then in 1948, she ran for the Senate and was elected, and she would go on to continue to serve until the early 70s.
When she runs in 1964, it's not on the two major party tickets. What ticket does she run on, and how does she frame herself?
Oh, it actually was.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, so she was a Republican, and she was a moderate Republican in the vein of the Thomas Deweys, the Dwight Eisenhowers. And it's interesting. The seminal moment for her, the moment that kind of stands out in her career, is that she was actually one of the first senators to actually take on McCarthy. And, when Joe McCarthy is rising, and her as a more moderate Republican, she was definitely in kind of the mainstream of American politics. In fact, when FDR was president, she supported a number of his policies, especially when it came to internationalism and defense preparedness. She kind of went against a lot of the Bob Taft isolationism. And McCarthy was obviously, as we all know from learning about him in history, he was had this big crusade to ferret out communists throughout the government, and it was very controversial, and people felt that he was, ruining lives and all that stuff. And she stood against him, and she gave a speech on the Senate floor, and I believe he was present in that speech, but it was one of those, it stood up against what he was saying, and it helped kind of turn the tide against McCarthy. And so, that kind of action and the fact that she's probably the most prominent woman in Congress at the time inevitably led to people saying, well, maybe this is the time for a woman president.
She runs on the Republican ticket. So I take it she's part of the mix in the Republican primary.
Sure. Well, it's interesting because, she had already been in politics. She had already been in the Senate by about 20 years by the time she gets to run. And I think she probably would have tried to run earlier. The problem is that, the Republican Party, and it's not her problem. I mean, it's not the country's problem. I guess it's kind of a problem from her perspective, is that, 1952 was Eisenhower's year. He ran for president. Then he ran in 1956. Won 2 terms, and then his vice president, Richard Nixon, ran in 60 against Kennedy and lost. So basically she was kind of frozen out of 3 elections because, no one's going to take on Eisenhower, and Nixon was kind of the natural heir. So 64 was the first time that there was really kind of an open race for the nomination. But by then she was already, a lot advanced in age. She was actually, she was in her 60s by then. And it's interesting because if you read about what people said about her, more people were concerned about her age than her gender. Huh. And whenever they took polls, they found, and the age thing being an issue, first of all, because people were saying, oh, it's the Cold War. We need a younger president who can handle, staying up, 2 weeks in a row like Kennedy did during the Cuban Missile Crisis and all that kind of stuff. And, but she would point out, well, Dwight Eisenhower is pretty old and he did a fine job and all that. And it's interesting because polls actually said that women were more concerned about her functioning as president than men. And so less women would support it. And one of the most interesting clips, is President Kennedy, not too long before he was assassinated, he gave one of his famous press conferences, those televised press conferences. And if you can watch the clip, and a journalist asked him about, Margaret Chase Smith, and Kennedy had served with her in Congress for a number of years. He knew her pretty well. And Kennedy was a Democrat, and so, the idea was Margaret Chase Smith might try to run in 1964. If she gets the nomination, she'd be her opponent. And a journalist asked him, what do you think about Margaret Chase Smith? And just upon asking that question, all the people there, mainly journalists, they started laughing. I mean, they started scoffing, like, oh, the idea of a woman running for president, it's so silly. And then President Kennedy actually, very serious face, he says, he didn't even smile. He didn't even kind of engage in any of the laughter. And he said, well, if I were a Republican running for president, I wouldn't want to face Senator Smith because she's a very formidable figure. So she definitely had respect. A lot of people respected her. She had a long time in service, and I think the McCarthy thing, she really got a reputation for being courageous.
That's 64, so that's when Goldwater was the Republican nominee.
Right.
How far did she get? Did it look like there was ever much of a chance of her getting the nomination, or was she mostly marginalized in the primary fight?
Well, what's interesting about it, and part of it is the fact that since she was frozen out, of those years, that was a time when I think the Republican Party, the moderates were a lot more powerful at the time, because it was the Thomas Dewey, Dwight